provided the conceptual foundation for our 20th century immigration policies that, for example, require refugees and the foreign relatives of Americans to have sponsors. You know the concept of sponsorship? Someone has to come forward and provide evidence of their financial ability to support that refugee or to support that relative should he or she fail to find work. This is the origin of the practices of sponsorship as we know them. The attack on working class immigrants did not cease in 1882. In 1885, for example, Congress passed, you know what I'm going to say, David, right? The Foreign Act, which forbade entry to any person who had been recruited to a job, a specific job in the United States. The goal of this 1885 law was to prevent the entry of the so-called coolie slaves from China and padrone slaves from Italy. These were workers who often had gone into debt to their bosses, who paid for their passages and then helped find jobs for them in the United States. The Foreign Act created a kind of catch-22 that may seem very familiar to today's immigrant workers. Immigrants arriving on the East or West Coast had to convince officials that, on the one hand, they were unlikely to become a public charge. They could support themselves, they could work, but they also had to deny that a job awaited them. So in rather sharp contrast to the Chinese restrictions, which have generated a flood of extremely valuable scholarship on the racialized exclusions, we still have no study of the Foreign Act and of its consequences. Maybe it had none. Maybe immigration agents ignored it. But we need to know when that exclusion of contract laborers were imposed at the border and under what conditions immigrant agents chose to evoke it. We do know, for example, that the public charge clause has had a very long life, and that during the 1930s, for example, it became the main justification for US consuls to deny visas to working class applicants from Mexico, where, remember, no numerical restrictions existed at the time, and from Jewish Germans, where there were tons of visas available, but the US consuls looked at Jewish refugees and said, they're likely to become public charges, let's not admit them. With the imposition of immigration restrictions, however, American employers begin to demand workers who couldn't be admitted under special temporary work visas. It's during this period of transition to restriction that the demands for programs that we would today call guest worker programs begin to emerge. Begun as experiments during World War I, the best known of these experiments in temporary labor recruitment, in violation, actually, of the 1885 Foreign Act, is the Bracero program, a guest worker program with Mexico implemented in 1943 and continued until 1964. Think about this for a minute. Just think about this. The Bracero program sought to encourage temporary, one-year migrations from Mexico at a time when, in fact, Congress had not yet imposed any numerical caps on migration from Mexico, and at a time when consuls in Mexico were nevertheless regularly denying Mexicans permanent visas of the type we today call green cards, because they might become public charges after all. As labor historian and labor historian Cindy Hahamovich has argued, these kinds of contradictions in immigration policy persisted mainly because they worked to create a category of workers, many of them from the Caribbean and from Latin America, who could be easily deported, and that, in fact, during the Great Depression of the 1930s, and again intermittently in the 1950s down to today, both could be and were reported, repatriated, and deported in very large numbers. Let me now turn quickly to my final two myths about immigration policy. I am sure you have all heard of the great immigration reform of 1965. The immigration law passed in that year is generally understood to have, quote, ended the era of racialized exclusions in US policy and to have caused a shift that certainly did occur from migration from Europe to migration from Latin America, Asia, and elsewhere, thus opening the gates to what many critics today refer to as torrents or floods of poor immigrants from the global South. I look at that interpretation of the past, and as an historian, I say, really? That's what happened? I scarcely recognize the 1965 law when it is described in this way. The 1965 immigration law that bears the name of two immigration reformers did end the national origins quotas that had been imposed on European and after World War II also on Asian immigrants. But at the same time, and this is the piece we tend to forget, the 1965 law imposed a numerical cap on every country in the world, including all of those countries in the Americas that had not been subject to numerical restriction prior to 1965. 1965 set a total number that could enter the United States from any country, regardless of race or religion or national origin. But this was the first time such numerical restrictions were imposed in the Americas. The result is that we begin to see high levels and growing levels of illegality, entry without inspection, and overstaying of visas, especially among low-skilled workers from Latin America. The 1965 law not only imposed numerical limits for the first time, and those 5,000 visas for unskilled workers, but it also did so at almost the exact time that the US Congress eliminated the Bracero program for temporary migrants. 4.5 million Mexicans had entered the United States under the Bracero program. They knew there were jobs, they knew where they were, they couldn't get visas, they had a numerical cap imposed on them for the first time, and we're still living with the results of that change. So why did this change in policy towards the American neighbors of the United States matter so much? On yet another dimension, the 1965 law deserves attention. Already in 1952, the United States had begun to create what it calls a preference system to assist consuls in assigning visas to the many applicants they receive every year. Within the numerical limits assigned for each country, consuls were directed to move professional, highly educated, and skilled workers, and eventually also workers with money to invest, to the top of the list. The unskilled, the uneducated fall to the bottom. And as you've heard multiple times here this week, that means 5,000 visas for the entire world for unskilled workers. Today, then, when people insist that workers who immigrate to the United States without visas should just, play fair, get in line, wait their turn, it's important to recognize that for the past 45 years, there has been no waiting line for unskilled workers. And recently, as I am sure you know, almost all proposals for revising the current US immigration policy that we live under today has been for increasing the numbers of temporary or permanent visas for immigrant workers with high skills, not low skills. As in the past, in other words, I think the United States is very reluctant to recognize that its economy continues to generate millions of unskilled and low-wage labor jobs. And when it does admit that need, it increasingly has demanded that such jobs be filled by deportable guest workers, or today, with illegals. While there is some debate over how many American workers would actually take these jobs and work for such wages, almost every case that I've heard described and studied at this conference describes Americans as unwilling to do those jobs, and overwhelming concentrations as a result of workers lacking documents in low-wage and low-skilled fields, about 2/3 of them from Latin America, in places like, as you know, construction, restaurant, hotels, and on the female side of things, domestic service positions. In other words, as in the 1880s, over 20 years ago, 30 years ago. When immigrants had to prove their ability to work without admitting that they could get a job, low-skilled immigrant workers today continue to face a catch-22. They know they can easily still find jobs in the US, but to do so they have to risk illegal entry. There is no legal way for them to enter the United States. And this brings me then to my last and final myth about US immigration policies. Recent discussions of the relationship between US immigration policy and the increasing challenges of global labor market competitions has now also turned an increasingly negative light on the one route through which low-skilled workers can actually enter the United States legally. And that's through family unification provisions. The United States does provide relatively more visas for family unification than most other countries in the world. But there's a reason for that. It does so in part because earlier generations of immigrants and their children, you know, my father and my generation, have become citizens, demanded to influence US immigration policy, and what they've asked for frequently has been visas for their family members. They've seen family reunification as the politically most appealing strategy for gaining visas in an era of continuing restriction. And since 1965, immigrants who enter the United States as close relatives of green card holders and as citizens enter with no numerical restrictions placed on them. What's the consequence of that? One important consequence is that the number of immigrants entering the country every year, it's always far in excess of the numerical cap that the US government and Congress places on immigrants. And some people say, immigration is out of control. There's so many more coming in than we actually legally allow. But the presence of those family reunifiers, and to a great deal also the presence of refugees, is perfectly legal. And it's a perfectly predictable consequence of the laws governing immigration as we know them today. Nevertheless, this focus on the family members has given way, oh, I thought I had a different slide, I don't, to a growing perception that family reunifiers are poorer quality immigrants than those in the past. And opponents of family reunification like to contrast the increasing proportions of women and children among immigrants as a sign of declining quality. We ought to be going for those high-tech workers, guys. What is this women and children crap? Who needs them? And family reunification has been used to a considerable degree by women and by children. Family reunification provisions have been part of every restrictive law that the United States has passed since 1882, including the Chinese restrictions. There was a provision for reunification, at least for merchants, under the 1882 law. Today, by contrast, we see an increasingly sharp distinction made between the immigrants of the past, who are now, 100 years later, imagined as heroic and white, and usually also male, let's face it, workers, and the immigrants of the present, who are instead these kind of worthless, dependent family members, children, women, and refugees. Many of whom, of course, are also peoples of color. We cannot forget that race figures into this debate as well. I remember a day at the Immigration History Research Center when I took a call from a woman who said to me, Donna, you know, the earlier immigrants gave to this country, and the ones now, they just take. They just take. The immigrant or the refugee who is imagined as taking or draining the United States of its resources rather than contributing to its wealth has become very common. Evidence of high rates of employment and low rates of welfare dependency among newcomers has done little to change that.